the individual doesn't have the ability to escape, to flee. And insofar as the abuse and the use of torture occurs, that use of whatever it might be that's being used becomes the condition for torture. And we'll talk in a little bit about what that might look like. Basically, the emphasis needs to be placed in a discussion on torture, on the idea of custody. So, what are some assumptions, right? There are two assumptions about torture. The first assumption about torture. The first assumption is that civilized societies, and I hate that term as I said, but civilized societies do not rely on torture. Right? The first assumption is that civil society, C-I-V, right? The first assumption is that civilized societies do not rely on torture. That's the first point. Next point is that those societies that refrain from torture are considered progressive, right? Those societies that refrain from torture are considered progressive, right? Are considered progressive. Okay, civilized societies do not torture. Societies that do not torture are considered progressive, and you can draw the conclusion to the syllogism. Therefore, civilized societies are progressive societies, right? So you want to be progressive, right? So a progressive society does not torture, and since civilized societies do not torture, civilized society is considered a progressive society. That's the first assumption. Pretty basic. Second assumption is that uncivilized societies do torture. They rely on torture. Right? So that uncivilized societies rely on torture. And there's obviously a lot of sort of rhetoric that is used to feed this notion of uncivilized societies relying on torture, primarily from movies. You'll watch movies and it'll be primarily a brown man that walks into the room. It could be a black guy, it can be an Arabic guy, it could be a very dark Indonesian person or what have you, and they'll walk into a dimly lit room and you'll see a few minutes in a movie of someone being tortured. Right? It's very rare that you will see depictions in the cinema, mainstream sort of media, of a white guy torturing somebody. Right? It's rare that you'll see that. And then obviously we do sort of the racial biased, racist conception that, it's more likely that these brown guys are here to torture people because they're less civilized, right? So there's obviously a very deep racist undertone to this discourse already, right? It's a very deep racist undertone, though it's not made explicit, right? So the idea that uncivilized society, and first of all, what does it even mean to be civilized, right? But anyway, uncivilized society rely on torture. So those societies that do not refrain from torture are considered backwards. And you draw the same syllogism, right? The consequence of the syllogism is that uncivilized societies are backwards. So I'm not going to write down a middle step, I'm just going to go to conclusion. Therefore, uncivilized societies, well, I don't want to do US, that would be bad. Uncivilized societies are backwards. Right? Therefore, uncivilized societies are backwards, right? So we can see that the two assumptions are pretty loaded. They're pretty loaded, and they're huge assumptions, right? They're huge assumptions. Civilized societies don't rely on torture, and we're progressive. Uncivilized societies do rely on torture, and they're backward. and then we make our generalizations based on these assumptions. However, what ends up happening is when you get depictions within the media, the same media that is feeding you images of, you know, psychopathic brown men torturing, you know, I'm just going to generalize here, innocent white men, or, you know, even innocent, you know, Westerners, and then you get a depiction of, you know, in a very racist sense. I hate to situate the discourse in race, but then you get, because I don't believe in race, but then you get the image of an American military serviceman who is white beating up Arabic men and demoralizing these people. I mean, it's an avalanche of problems that follow from that. Not just on sort of the rhetorical, now this presents a huge danger to our men and women abroad, you know, protecting the population. Obviously it does. Those images are going to be used to incite a new generation of hate. Maybe even justifiably so, incite a new generation of hate. That's sort of what that's how politicians talk. On a much, much deeper level, it delegitimizes the authority and the assumptions that civil societies don't participate in acts of torture. Because I just saw the pictures, I just saw dogs barking at the man, I just saw men stacked up in a pyramid, completely disrobed. I saw someone being punched in the face. There are images of a guy who's dead on the floor. These things are hard to swallow as images, but even more profound, even bigger than the individual horrific circumstances that happened to these individuals, was the fact that it collapses our assumptions, right? It's not the case that Western society, arguably, has been this move from less to more torture. It's just, more to less torture. It's just been the case that, as I said in the initial quote, not me, but as the author said in the initial quote, torture must be practiced in secret and denied in public. That secretive practice is now introduced into the public sphere, and it caused an avalanche of problems, right? And thus, the problem of what happened in Abu Ghraib. So let's look at the problem in Abu Ghraib and look at it not from sort of like a political sort of, you know, bullet point speech, but really conceptual articulation of the problems that it created as far as human rights violations were concerned. The first thing that we recognize right off the bat is that the depictions of the abuses completely destroyed any credibility that the assumption was legitimized, that civilized societies weren't practicing and engaging in torture. And now it seems to be the case that, hey, civilized society is uncivilized. So if we were supposed to be considered uncivilized before, we're going to have to step the carnage up, because you're doing what we thought you weren't doing. So now it's going to escalate the level of violence, right? It introduces holistically a more violent escalation, a demand really for more violent escalation. Because if you're going to play dirty, we're going to play dirtier. That's sort of the mentality. So the problem. Okay, the problem of Abu Ghraib. Alright, so, quote, this is the bottom of page 9, quote, the public exposure of torture of Iraqi detainees by U.S. soldiers working in interrogation rings run by military intelligence, right? So, there's a lot there. One, public exposure, right? The public exposure of torture. The public exposure of torture of Iraqi detainees by U.S. soldiers. Working in interrogation rings run by military intelligence and American security contractors, right, led by the United States and security contractors, not necessarily directly